This is episode number 3 with Danny Lennon. Welcome to the Grow Podcast with myself, David O'Connor, where my goal is to interview world-class guests so you can constantly progress as a person in terms of your training, your mindset and nutrition. So without further ado, let's dive in. How are we keeping, guys? And welcome to episode number 3 of the podcast. And today I have my good friend Danny Lennon on the show, who is the founder of Sigma Nutrition and Performance, who is a company that provides evidence-based information through media content and their online coaching services as well. Now, Danny hosts a top-ranked podcast which is called Sigma Nutrition Radio, if you haven't heard of that yet. And Danny's podcast was actually a big kickstarter for me to get this podcast going too, so I'm grateful for that and to have him on my 3rd episode as well. Now, Danny has a formal scientific background in academia, completing a master's degree in nutritional sciences at the University College Cork. And as well, during the time, Danny researched directly under the world-renowned researcher Professor Kevin Cashman. Along with all that, Danny took classes in biochemistry, clinical nutrition, micronutrient interactions and physiology. And previous to that as well, Danny also completed a degree in biology and physics education. As well as producing media content, Danny works as a performance nutritionist to elite athletes in weight class-based sports, including professional MMA fighters, professional boxers, and competitive powerlifters. And based on all the work with these fighters and boxers, Danny has recently released his Sigma weight cutting system for MMA and boxing as well, which we'll get into at the end of the show. Now, outside the nutrition world, Danny is an avid lifter as well, and he's a drug-free, raw powerlifter, and has a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu blue belt. And the last one, which doesn't really say much for Danny, is that he's a lifelong Arsenal fan. So today we're going to cover a multitude of topics based on setting up a fat loss diet. So you can go away and know how to strip away body fat based on principles, not tactics or methods. So what we're going to talk about is the principles behind driving body composition change, the other factors behind calories in versus calories out, and what that means for you. Where does a 40-year-old kind of start with this kind of stuff versus someone who's, let's say, younger, like 20, 25-year-old. We're going to talk about sustainable fat loss targets and how Danny actually troubleshoots these type of phases as well, how he troubleshoots the targets, different foods, etc. And there's a lot more shown in there as well. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Danny to the podcast. Danny, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, man. Pleasure to be here.
No problemo. Danny, I suppose, just for anybody who's living under a rock and does not know who Danny Lennon is, if you can just give us a quick breakdown on, who are you?
Cool. I suppose the shortest Cliff Notes version is that my company is Sigma Nutrition, where the whole goal is to put out evidence-based information around nutrition, performance, and other aspects relating to, I suppose, overall health and sporting performance. So that's primarily done through 2 different branches of the company. So one is media production. So things like our podcast is probably what Sigma Nutrition is mainly known for. So Sigma Nutrition Radio is a weekly to maybe twice a week podcast where I talk with various different researchers, practitioners, etc. in nutrition and performance. And again, that's where I suppose most of people will generally have came across the company. So in addition to the podcast, we'll also do video content, webinars, articles. We do quite a lot of seminars, conferences, corporate wellness talks, etc. So trying to promote good quality information in the industry through things from an evidence-based perspective. And then second to that, we have our online coaching service where we work one-on-one in quite an intensive manner with people on either their nutrition or their training programming, or often a combination of the two. And so we have a couple of different coaches that work with me with clients as well. So I know you had Gar on the podcast recently. So Gar would be one of our coaches, along with Arthur Lynch, who is a PhD candidate in muscle physiology, as well as a elite level powerlifter and powerlifting coach as well. So between that, we just try and put all this evidence-based information into practice and essentially help people as best we can with our coaching practice. So they're the 2 main sides of the company, and that's really it from what I'm doing right now. And then generally, if people are interested in my background academically, I have a master's degree in nutritional sciences from UCC and had an undergraduate degree in biology and physics. I spent a year teaching before I went and got into the whole nutrition thing. And that's pretty much it, I think.
Brilliant. Now, I know you've already covered it and all that, but I always like to challenge people by asking them to condense what you've just said into a 10-second format. So, Danny, if I was to ask you very, very quickly in 10 seconds, what do you do?
Promote evidence-based nutrition information through media content and coaching.
Nice, very nice. No, it's nice. It's actually a nice challenge to do that. If you meet somebody on the fly, at a conference or something, you're telling them what you do straight away. That's where I actually learned it first, and I'm kind of kicking off all the podcasts with it. So I suppose, Danny, today we're going to talk about everything in relation to nutrition for fat loss. And again, I know we're going to have a diverse range of people listen to this, and sometimes kind of fat loss gets lost in people thinking that it's only for people that need to lose a lot of weight. But it's what really, just to set the scene, is what I mean by fat loss is for someone who might want to lose 1 to 2 to 3 stone plus, or somebody that just wants to go from being a bit lean to going seriously lean or getting a six-pack, whatever it might be. So with that, Danny, I suppose the first question I want to kind of set the scene with is, we have the topic of health, and then we have the topic of fat loss. I think there's a bit of a foggy kind of thing around this where people believe that, right, if I eat clean, if I just focus on being super healthy, I'm going to automatically get fat loss. Is that the case?
That's actually a really good way of framing this whole conversation, because I think that's where maybe a lot of people become disillusioned if they've made changes to their nutrition with this goal of, again, eating healthily. And then if their goal is to primarily lose body fat, especially if it's a considerable amount of body fat, or in the second case you mentioned someone going from relatively lean to very lean, the thing to understand is the underlying principles of what is driving decreases in body fat and body weight over time. So the primary thing that's going to cause that to happen is when there's a energy deficit, so that there's more energy being expended by your body than you are taking in via the diet over a considerable length of time. Now, the thing with eating healthily is, if we take a typical scenario where someone is eating let's just call it a poor quality diet, so lots of processed food, maybe they're over consuming on very palatable foods that are high in sugar, high in calories, etc., and not eating, say, enough good quality lean protein or vegetables, etc., right? And they make that switch to a healthier diet, and they start cleaning up, so to speak, or how most people turn it, and eating better quality foods. Typically, you'll often see people will lose some body fat and will lose some weight initially in that process, just purely because those changes are likely to lead to them eating less calories overall. However, oftentimes you'll find people who are maybe aiming to lose body weight, but are eating still a good quality diet, but for whatever reason they just say, like, my weight is staying the same, my body composition is relatively similar, and I don't understand it because all the foods I eat are pretty good. And what you have to understand is that your body is not set up for you to continually losing body fat over time. Your body is actually very well regulated, and it has all these different feedbacks within the body, so different hormones that will trigger different feedback loops to try and keep you within reason at a relatively what we call energy homeostasis, so matching your energy expenditure to your energy intake. And so it's not set up for you to be under eating all the time. And so even if you're eating good quality foods, if you are not intentionally under eating, then it's likely you're going to consume enough calories that's going to match your energy expenditure, or on the flip side, your body will bring down your energy expenditure to match that energy intake. So if I just take an example to try and make this clear, if someone for a number of days starts eating good quality food and so they're being relatively active, even with that, the amount that they're likely to take in is going to be dictated by their appetite regulation, how hungry they feel, et cetera, which are all driven by a number of different hormones in the body. And so your body is going to want you to take in an amount that's suitable for your level of energy expenditure, so how many calories you are burning. And that is, like, that it doesn't matter what types of food you're doing, you're still going to be probably going to be eating a number to match that. And that's why we see so many people, and I'm sure you can think of a number of people who have, say, been at the same body weight for roughly, like within, let's say, 1 or 2 pounds, say, roughly the same body weight for years on end, but have yet never tracked a calorie or don't track their macronutrients, et cetera, et cetera. They just, by normal eating and eating as kind of as they intuitively normally do, their body weight stays relatively similar. And there's a number of these people going around. And so the body's pretty good at matching its expenditure and its intake. And so by simply eating good quality food, you are not going to be under eating or eating in a calorie deficit that's going to cause fat loss in the long term. And so that's kind of the real crux of the matter, in that to cause sustained fat loss over a period of time, your body needs to be in a calorie deficit. And to do that, you're probably not going to be able just to eat intuitively or eat when you're hungry, because your body doesn't want you to undereat. So you have to almost force yourself to be in a deficit by either tracking your calories or by eating a bit less than you would like to, or decreasing your portion size more than what is normal. Some sort of tool to make sure that you're eating less than you're expending. And so there's clear differences in what causes fat loss versus what is a healthy diet. So I suppose that's the biggest kind of take home there, is that the principles underlying eating for body fat loss are different to the principles for eating for long-term health.
And I think as well, like if people took and rewinded what you just said and replayed it over and over again, the world would be such a better place. I think, we get lost in this fact that if you do have those people, Danny, that fluctuate around 1 to 2 pounds for majority of their life, and they've never really had a problem with weight, and they eat healthy, and then they make themselves believe that it's okay if I eat healthy, I won't put on weight, etc., etc. But then you have someone else like who might try and change that, and as you said, the body is not set up to continually lose body fat over time. So while they might make a short-term progress, long-term, to do that, there needs to be some sort of tracking, some sort of control, or decrease in portion size, whatever it is, to make sure you're in that sustained calorie deficit. But that was actually the next question I had for you. Like, what is the fundamental principle behind all this? Which you've already said, you need to be in a calorie deficit. Now, you've already kind of stated, Danny, to a small little level, but I want to touch base on a bit more. It's kind of backtracking a bit, but is it as simple as just being in a calorie deficit? What other factors come into play? Yeah, we've already kind of you touched on hormones a bit, but is it as easy as that?
No, that's a really good question, because when I say that, really the primary thing that's going to be driving changes in body composition, so on one end, decreasing your body weight or decreasing body fat levels, is going to be a sustained calorie deficit over a period of time, or gaining body weight, and whether that's either gaining muscle mass and or gaining body fat, that's going to be down to a calorie surplus over a given period of time. While that's the different, so the energy balance is the main driving factor behind those, that's not all that I suppose explanatory when it comes to what to do from a practical perspective. Simply telling someone, go and eat in a calorie deficit, is not really that useful of information, because it's actually, like we said, we're not primed to do it, so we have to be able to know how to do this from a practical perspective. And this is where all the other factors come into play, right? So if we were to take someone and have them eat, say, so let's take yourself, Dave. If we were to say that we force you to only eat 1,500 calories a day for the next 8 weeks, but you could eat them from whatever food it was. So we only put you on, say, an all ice cream diet. So the only thing you're eating is ice cream, but the amount most you're eating each day is 1,500 calories. For someone your size, with that lean body mass you have and your activity level, that's a huge calorie deficit, and that you're going to be expending way more energy. So you will be losing body weight and will be losing body fat over that 8 weeks, and probably a considerable amount of it, purely because the calories are so low, even though the food you're eating is just pure ice cream, right? And you can do that with any food. Now, the issue is that from a real world practical perspective, the reason why that's not that relevant or probably that useful for people, or is going to be very difficult to do, is that the food choices that we make and the types of, number one, the macronutrient profile, but also the kind of food quality and the palatability, which I'll get to in a minute, all these different factors will likely influence how much we want to eat. And so if we can set up our diet in a way that we're slightly under eating, but at the same time, we're not only eating healthy foods so we're getting enough micronutrients, but we're also eating foods that are going to make us feel less hungry whilst we're dieting, then it's going to increase our chances of being successful in the long term. So that's why a diet mainly based on good quality food is still a good idea for someone who's dieting, even though the main thing driving it is calories. And sure, like you can lose weight eating a diet of complete junk food, but it just becomes a lot more difficult. And that's for a number of reasons. Number one is if we have foods that are, say, a typical processed food that most people think of. So think of a food that's high in sugar. It's going to be high in calorie density, so a lot of calories for the amount of space it takes up on your plate. It's typically going to be low in fiber, probably low in protein, and it's going to be what we call hyperpalatable, so very pleasurable to the brain, and it triggers off this response in the reward center of our brain. When we have foods like these, it's very hard to stick to a small amount of calories of them, right? Because they're so rewarding to the brain, and we don't get the same satiety response. We don't get feeling full after eating them because there's, say, not enough fiber, not enough protein in them to give us that satiety response. Usually they're small volumes of food, so again, it doesn't take up much space in our stomach. So instead, if we were to have foods that include, say, meals of lots of vegetables with some lean meats and good quality foods, what they tend to do is they provide us with, say, enough micronutrients, which is good from a health perspective. They also provide good quality protein, which is going to make us feel full and satiated after these meals. It provides us with plenty of fiber, which again has the same role, not only for health, but also for satiation and satiety. And then it also, because the foods are not overly palatable, it's more difficult to overeat on those types of foods, right? So it's much easier for our body to kind of match our intake to our expenditure, like I mentioned earlier. So when I said earlier that our bodies are actually really good at matching our intake or our expenditure to our intake, so in other words, when we expend a certain amount of calories per day, our body will tell us when we need to eat more food if we haven't eaten enough yet, and it will tell us when we've got enough food in and tell us to stop eating by, say, making us feel full. And then the reverse would be when it wants us to consume more calories, it'll turn up our appetite. And it does that through different hormones, ghrelin, leptin, etc. But when we have a lot of highly processed, poor foods in the diet, we don't really get the same responses for them, or at least the palatability or how pleasurable those foods are. It's easier to override all these physiological mechanisms that we have in the body to kind of control our intake, and so it's much more easy to overeat on them. So sure, like the main thing is going to be your calorie and macronutrient breakdown are going to be the main things that determine your body composition. But from a real practical perspective, the types of foods you consume and your dietary habits are going to be the things in real life that dictate how likely it is you're going to eat a certain amount of calories.
No, it's a lovely way of putting it across, Danny, because it's just people understanding that, yeah, we might say energy balance or calorie deficit is the main role being played in whether you lose body fat or not. You still need to drive home the kind of stuff that's, under the bigger stuff that's underlying it, the stuff you actually coach people with too. We've touched on a lot there, Danny, already. We've talked about, the fundamental principles of losing weight or body fat, gaining it. Like you said, you need to be in a calorie surplus, and then maintaining your weight is just having that homeostasis. So eating matching your expenditure is, I think, the way you put it. Going from here, Danny, I suppose the next step is I've kind of forgotten how to mention, right? Total calories, just for a very, very basic introduction, is made up of your macronutrient intake. I suppose, can you give us a very, very quick, Danny, synopsis on what is protein, carbs and fats, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, sure. So I probably should have prefaced this whole discussion on energy balance talking about the two sides of energy balance. So energy in versus energy out, or you can think of it as calories in versus calories out. And like you correctly said, calories in is just made up of the calories that are in your food. And any food that you that you consume is going to be made up of a mix of different macronutrients. So the three primary macronutrients that we have are protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And then you can also think of a subcategory of carbohydrate being fiber, which is an important one to consider as well, which obviously have health functions and are kind of digested differently to, say, non-fibrous carbohydrates. But generally we have protein, carbs, and fat, and then we also will keep an eye on fiber. And if we're getting really technical, we would talk about alcohol as well, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. So with protein, carbohydrate, and fat, they all are essentially have many different roles in the body, but there's a couple of important ones that we should consider from if we're talking about this perspective of someone who's aiming to lose body fat. I mentioned a couple on protein. So a lot of people will associate protein with muscle mass because, again, probably a lot of that comes from, say, the supplement industry talking about protein. And this is very much true that muscle is going to be made up of various muscle proteins, and so we need proteins around to repair and build new muscle structure. So if someone's dieting, protein becomes important because it can help not only recover from training sessions, but help preserve our lean body mass or our muscle mass. And so this is important because when we're losing body weight, we want to lose that weight from body fat stores, not just from anywhere. So in order to lose most of that weight from body fat, we want to conserve or keep as much muscle mass as we have. So keeping protein high will help with that to some degree, as will, say, doing resistance training regularly and making sure that over a long period of time we don't massively undereat for extended periods. And again, there's a few caveats to that. Then we have dietary fat. So again, lots of important roles of dietary fat in the body. So I think a lot of people have started to come around now to the idea that fat isn't this thing that needs to be completely demonized or avoided at all costs, or if you have any fat in the diet, it's going to cause heart disease. I think there are kind of a lot of outdated views. We know that dietary fat plays an important role in the body, and probably for most people aiming to have probably 20 to 30, maybe 20 to 40% of their diet coming from dietary fat, or of their calories coming from dietary fat is probably a good place to be. So this would be like the fat that we see in olive oil, olives, avocados, nuts, eggs, etc. These can all provide good quality fat, as well as particularly omega-3 fatty acids in, say, fatty fish. And on top of that, then we can obviously use fat, and we can use really all the macronutrients, but we can use fat for energy as well if we need to, particularly when we're exercising at low intensities or just generally at rest. Most of the energy we derive is going to be from metabolizing fat. So then we have carbohydrate. And again, there's been a lot of talk about carbohydrates over the years, going from a place of more carbohydrates then to the whole kind of low carb thing. And there's a lot of maybe confusion there as well. But carbohydrates are, again, just simply another macronutrient that can play important roles, particularly if someone has athletic aspirations, making sure there's adequate carbohydrate to fuel that training. And so generally, while there is a number of different things going on, generally carbohydrates can be thought of as a macronutrient that can provide a fuel source for a certain type of activity. And then obviously fiber has a whole other issue that we could get into, but primarily people will talk about that in terms of gastrointestinal function, so gut health and have a healthy functioning gut. So they're the main macronutrients we talk about, and together they're like a combination on all sorts of different foods, and then the calorie content of the foods accounts for the energy inside of the equation. And then on the other side, the energy expenditure side of the equation, or calories out, there's a whole other set of components that make up that we can touch on if you want to.
Yeah, I think we could go off on a whole other tangent if we got into the calories outside of it. But I suppose it's no harm mentioning we're assuming here somebody is resistance training. They're putting their body under load and they're training, we'll say, 3 to 4 times a week or something like that. Let's just pretend that that's what they're already doing, because we both know, Danny, like they're not going to get the results they want without doing that. In terms of, let's say, muscle tone and losing body fat, to produce the muscle tone they want, which is the easiest way to get that across, I think. I think we should have started with the probably the calories in, calories out side of things to dumb it down a small bit and start with the protein, carbs and fats and how that makes up total calories, and then we talked about the calorie deficit. So we have the scene set, I hope. So let's get into like what I really want to get from you, Danny, which is, right, let's just say if you have, I'm going to give you two examples because we can talk about both. Let's just pretend that I'm a 40-year-old father and I just have been up to my eyeballs the last few years with work, and the kids now are at an age where I can kind of finally focus on myself a bit more, but I've 4 stone up. And then you might have someone else who is 25, they've put on a bit of a gut because they're not as active anymore and they're working an office job and they just want to just get a bit leaner, lose the gut, and maybe potentially down the line get a six-pack. If you start with the parent, I suppose, first, where would you actually start with that person, and where would we start, what would we do?
Yeah, so the first thing is probably to kind of try and audit where the low-hanging fruit is, or where's the changes we can make that are going to have the biggest impact off the front end. So it's very rare that for our coaching we would try and completely overhaul someone's diet. Most often, because it's just not that necessary, it makes it more unnecessarily difficult, and it is making changes for the sake of it. So what we'll try and do is, okay, what things will absolutely have a big impact and make a big difference, and which ones of those are doable right now are going to see a change relatively quickly, or which ones are the easiest ones to implement. So like I said, depending on the individual, this could be a number of things. But for a lot of people in that position you gave of say, someone just has never really paid attention to their diet, they're 40 years old, maybe they've started training somewhere now and they want to get in shape and lose a few stone in body weight. Probably the first thing is just to get a kind of clear structure of when they're eating. Oftentimes when people have, especially when they've gradually gained weight over a number of years, it's not often that it's from them consuming just massive quantities of food at lunch and dinner, right? It's usually that it's an accumulation of food across the day and that they have a high frequency of snacking, or at least that's what we typically find, in that people aren't aware of how many calories they're consuming. So, and we see this in research all the time. People, when they're asked to report how much food they eat, they always will underreport by a significant amount. When they're asked to gauge how many calories they eat on a daily basis, people really have no idea, and most of the time will massively underestimate how much they're actually consuming. And so a lot of that time is just from picking at food throughout the day, having a few things here and there across the day that adds up quite substantially by the end of the day. And so simply by getting some structure on their daily intake can be useful. So this could be something as simple as saying, okay, I'm going to have a breakfast that is high in protein, because typically we see for the average person in the general population, breakfast time and snack times tend to be the main time where their protein intake is very low. So if we're trying to increase someone's protein intake, we can say, okay, we'll focus on getting a high protein breakfast. That will provide this person with some satiety, make them feel full, and so it's going to then impact their food choices later in the day, rather than them typically just say getting a slice of toast with some jam on it and then rushing out the door. If they can have a breakfast that's high in protein, so maybe that's some scrambled eggs, maybe it's an omelette, maybe it's some Greek yogurt, or maybe even a whey protein shake, something like that. They're getting some protein in early. Then we could say, okay, then we're going to have 2 other main meals. If you want to call them a lunch and dinner, you can. And then I'm going to have 1 to 2 other times a day where I'm going to have a snack. At least that's planned ahead of time. And again, if they can make some of those meals high in protein, that's going to be a good choice. Trying to, again, fit some basic things of, okay, those main meals, how much vegetables can I get on here? Can I make a certain amount of that? And just having that kind of clear structure of, I'm going to be having 3 main meals, 1 to 2 snacks, focusing on some high protein throughout the day. That kind of structure at least gives a starting point, rather than just eating on the run or eating at random. At least there's some plan of when and what you're going to eat over time. A second kind of thing that I think is a thing that can have a drastic difference for most people, that is either undervalued, or people will kind of say that they just are not in a position to be able to change it, is just their sleep. And if there's anything that is even probably perhaps more important for long-term health than getting their nutrition right, it's perhaps sleep. And I just think we've even seen there's so much research showing how sleep restriction will affect your food choices the following day, both in the quantity of food you eat due to increases in those appetite hormones. So there's one called ghrelin that will increase even after 1 to 2 nights of poor quality or low amounts of sleep. So if you're sleeping 4 to 5 hours, for example, you'll have an increased amount in this hormone ghrelin, which will influence your appetite and make it more likely that you overeat even without realizing it. And then we also have then with sleep restriction or people that are sleep deprived, you know that it affects what typical food choices they actually go for. So it's more likely that they go for those highly palatable, rewarding foods that I mentioned earlier. So ones that are high in sugar, high in calories, maybe high in fat, and then low in fiber and protein and are very, very palatable or pleasurable to the brain. And so straight away, if you're walking around all the time on 4 hours sleep, it's going to be much more difficult to stick to a good quality diet than if you were getting much more sleep. So if you can push that up over time. Now, I realize that again in the practical world, it's going to be difficult for people to be able to say, oh yeah, I can get 8 hours of perfect sleep every night. But the idea is just over time, if you know you're not getting enough sleep, how can you do things to gradually increase that? Even if it's by, okay, this week I'm just going to try and get an extra 20 to 30 minutes in bed for at least 5 of those nights. How can I do that? What would I have to change? What behaviors would I have to put in place? And so there are a couple of big ones that are easy straight off the bat, that if you're sleeping better and you have a general idea and structure planned ahead of types of meals you want to have that are generally good quality, that will make a tremendous difference to start from. And then from that point on, you can start making some changes that will influence probably how many calories you're going to be expending. So if you're not making progress and your body weight is staying the same for weeks on end, you know you need to either change your energy in or energy out. And the easiest one to change is your diet. So you may play around with changing your portion sizes or changing your meal frequency or changing the types of meals you're having, something that's going to cause a decrease in the calories that's coming in. And then from there, you're going to just keep monitoring and see where that point is where you can continue to progress. So I know I kind of went on a bit there, but they're kind of the two big ones that I would see from a very starting out kind of first port of call for someone in that position. And then as we go from there, there's a number of different changes we can make for more specific examples, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. It's often the basics that we do miss though, Danny, as well, and people don't realize how simple they can get started with it. And like we say to all our guys here as well, that's more or less what we start off people with, is it's general structure. From the structure, we work on things like water intake, because that's going to have another knock-on effect. Protein intake, we might look at that one thing at a time, and we might look at veg intake. It all depends on the person. It all depends on their schedule. It depends. We've had people in the past that have just such a bad view on vegetables, and they've never ate them from a young age. So, how do you contract that? How do you do X, Y, or Z? And then moving from there, then obviously down the line, that will get them results. It will. If you're not getting results, maybe it's time to dive a little deeper and ask why. You're obviously not in your caloric deficit anymore, but this is kind of why now I wanted to use the second guy. Let's just pretend guy number 2. He's 25 years old. He's out of college a couple of years, but he's settled into bad habits now, and he's not training as much. Maybe he does a few runs a week. He has a bit of a structure down, but he has a bit of a gut, and he wants to get rid of it, and maybe potentially go on, get really lean, whatever it is. But this guy maybe needs a bit more structure and, what's the word I'm looking for? A bit more in depth, we'll say, into it. So what would you do with that person, Danny?
Yeah, so again, any of our coaching process is essentially kind of troubleshooting, right? So we try and look at what is preventing this person from getting to where they want to go, and then what likely steps are going to change that. So from a very practical point of view, for most kind of guys in that situation that we start working with, even if we're not planning on doing it for a long period of time, we will get them to track their calorie and macronutrient intake for at least 1 to 2 weeks. And this achieves a couple of things. So for maybe people who aren't familiar, this is simply like getting a app that you can log your food in. So we use MyFitnessPal. It's a free app to download on your phone. You just enter your foods into that, and at the end of the day, it will give you a breakdown of how many calories you consumed, how much protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And so we'll get someone to start tracking their intake for, like we say, a week of 1 to 2 weeks. Depending on who they are, we may or may not give them some targets to aim for. And again, depending on who they are and where they're starting from, how tight those targets are will differ, and I can explain that in a minute. But generally, the idea of getting them to track for that initial period, and we do this for virtually across the board for most clients. And again, I just want to point out that this is not something that is a long-term strategy for everyone. It's certainly not necessary, and for a lot of people, is probably not something that they either want to do or need to do. But from a kind of a kind of task to do that gives or teaches someone certain skills, particularly when we're talking about this individual in this case, who is someone who's relatively lean already, but maybe just wants to get very lean, then tracking their food intake and looking at their calories and macronutrients can be very useful because it does two things. Number one, it gives them an awareness of what they're doing already. Like I mentioned previously, most people have no clue of just how much calories they're consuming. They might not know how little protein they're taking in. They might think they're consuming a lot more. And it might flag up some other things, like, for example, if they're an athlete and they're playing intercounty GA and they're trying to train 6 to 7 times over a 5-day window, but we notice that based on the foods they're eating way too little carbohydrate, that's going to be affecting their performance. And then we can start making some changes from there. So there's a whole host of different things it may flag from a purely an awareness point of view. Secondly, by just tracking for a couple of weeks, it teaches people a couple of skills around just what's in certain meals and what's in their food. So if you track meals for just 2 weeks, even if you never tracked again after that, you will have at least some appreciation of roughly how many calories is a meal portioned this size, or certain snacks that you can view as healthy, just how many calories might be in those, and you can make better decisions over time. And then, so rather than eating just less food to try and get in a calorie deficit, you may just make smarter substitutions. So, for example, you realize that by going from having a snack of, say, full-fat Greek yogurt with a handful of granola and a spoon of organic honey, which you log into your app and sees it comes out at 480 calories, you swap that for a very similar snack of some 0% fat Greek yogurt with a handful of frozen berries and a scoop of whey protein. You now see that that's only like 220 calories, and it's got 3 times the amount of protein. And so these kind of simple substitutions can now be made because you have an awareness of what are in different foods. So for that person in your case, we'll get them tracking for a couple of weeks. And based on that, we'll get an idea of if their body weight is not decreasing, and that's their goal, we know that their rough average calorie intake is going to be approximately a maintenance level of calories. So maintenance being what keeps their body weight at the same level. So we're going to need to decrease the amount of calories they're consuming whilst keeping their activity at the same level it's currently at. And so we'll give them a target calorie number of, okay, this is what we're targeting for, and we'll make some practical change and recommendations of how they can achieve that and try to get them eating at that lower calorie level until they're achieving fat loss at an acceptable rate. And again, this differs from person to person, but for someone in that case where they're maybe relatively lean, or maybe just a slightly carrying slightly too much weight, something like about 1 pound per week or half a kilo per week of body weight decrease is likely a good initial target for that person to aim for.
Brilliant. Again, like, it's funny because every time you finish up something, it leads exactly to my next question as well. And I think I wanted to base that off. Okay, I suppose we'll backtrack first a little. Track calorie intake for 1 to 2 weeks, so you'll get maybe a baseline of how your body weight is fluctuating. It's going to give you awareness of how much you're consuming and what's in foods, which again I think is like a revelation for people when they see it. You talked about then, Danny, if his body, let's just pretend this person is eating 3,000 calories and he's not decreasing on average. That's what you got from tracking, and he's eating 3,000 calories and he is starting resistance training 3 times a week, at a basic level, and then he goes maybe does some sort of run at the weekend or something like that. I know it's different for everyone and it's hard to put it into a podcast, but you give them a target calorie number. What would be a rough reduction in caloric intake that we might base, we might base something off?
Yeah. So if we're talking about like a general figure that's going to be something that should give a decent amount of fat loss and is not probably too wild of a decrease starting off, I would say starting point of aiming for about 15% decrease in calories, maybe even 20%. So somewhere between 15 to 20% reduction in your maintenance calories is probably going to be a figure that if you start doing that, that's going to start giving a decrease in body weight. And you can kind of tell from there if you want to go more or less. And again, there's a number of different factors that will dictate how aggressive to go with the diet. So we could mention things like, well, if you're an athlete, you want to go a bit more moderately so your performance stays up. If we're talking about then the flip side, if there was, say, an obese person, then we can go more aggressive and they still lose a lot of weight. But in general, I think aiming for 15 to 20% reduction in caloric intake is probably a good starting point. And then from there, just judge on how you're progressing at that. If you're progressing week to week and you're decreasing your body weight by, say, about 1% per week, then great, keep going with that. If you are not progressing enough, then you can decrease slightly more. Or if it's going too fast and you're feeling really fatigued all the time, the diet is getting really, really difficult and your weight is dropping too fast for your liking, or you're finding it difficult to recover from training sessions, then you can maybe eat a bit more calories and so that the deficit is not as large. But I think the vast majority of people would be perfectly fine on a deficit of 15 to 20%.
Nice one. Yeah, because then from there, I suppose that leads exactly to my next question. What would be, I know it's very, very hard to answer again when you have different populations, but what would be sustainable general guidelines of targets of fat loss across a week?
Yeah, so one thing I always try and mention at this juncture would be for people to remember that a fat loss diet is not something that's necessarily the same as a sustainable long-term healthy diet, right? In that there's so many people that are caught in the cycle of dieting all the time, and then all the time their focus, like year-round, their focus is on eating a diet that they want to lose weight. And instead, I think a better idea is for, regardless of the person, now from person to person, the time frame will change, but in general, it should be focused periods of focusing on dieting, reducing body weight, and then going back to a diet that's more for a period of time that's sustainable, that you maintain your weight, even if that's for like 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, just so that what weight you have lost, you now maintain that weight loss, because that's the most difficult thing. And you don't always have to be decreasing your body weight. You can hang out there for a while, keep the same body weight, take a break from the actual dieting process, and then if you have more body fat to lose, then go into another phase of dieting again. And so what that kind of ties into then is that you don't want to be always losing body fat, because by nature that can't be sustainable, because you're always under eating, and to some degree you're always going to be a bit hungry when you're dieting, because that's what you're doing. You're under eating and your body's going to want you to eat a bit more. So I would get people to focus on going through periods of, let's say, 8 to 10 to 12 weeks, whatever it is for someone, where they're going to be in a calorie deficit. So in other words, they're going to be under eating slightly, so their body weight is dropping by about 1%. Do that over that period of time, and then spend a bit of time where they're not dieting, but they don't want their weight to rebound back up. So they're having good, healthy habits and keeping their body weight roughly where it is, and then they can transition back into another phase. And I think if they do that, then you can aim like I said, about a nice sustainable rate of change would be about a decrease in their body weight of about 1% per week. Now, where it changes, if you have someone getting into that scenario where you said that's going very, very lean, or wants to get down to very lean levels of body fat, then over time you want to have a smaller and smaller change in how much their body weight is dropping, so that they can keep onto more muscle mass. So as they're getting leaner, that might change from 1% body weight change per week to only 0.5% of their body weight change per week. So for example, if they're a 100 kilo guy, instead of losing 1 kilo per week, they're aiming to lose 0.5 kilo per week. Or if they're like a 50 kilo woman, they're going from, instead of losing 0.5 kilo a week, to like 0.2 kilos per week, something like that. So you can change it over time as you get leaner and leaner, but in general about 1% is a sustainable enough rate, I think.
And would there be any times, Danny, where you might go over that 1%?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so many different cases here. I wrote a 3-part blog series talking about aggressive dieting, or how fast can you diet and make progress, and is there a case of going too aggressive with the diet? And really, if done correctly, you can go a lot more aggressive in a vast number of cases. I think one is if we take someone who is very overweight or obese and has a lot of body fat to lose, if particularly it can be very perhaps not disheartening, but it's harder to buy into that long-term process if you say, okay, we're only going to lose half a kilo per week, right? Particularly if they've got a lot of body fat to lose. And so we don't necessarily have to do that. They can aim for higher rates of weight loss, particularly in those early stages when they have a lot of body fat to lose, because even if they go very aggressive with their diet, the vast majority of their weight will still be dropped from body fat just because there is so much of it there. Versus someone who's very lean, if you diet too aggressively, you're at more risk of losing muscle mass or lean body mass. So for people with lots to lose, particularly in the early stages, they can target a lot more. So they can go and try and lose 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 pounds for a week in the early stages, as long as they're aware that they can't keep doing that forever, and that sure, they can have this like fast kickstart to things early on, but then they should in time maybe transition to a more sustainable rate, like we mentioned, that 1%. But certainly they can go far above 1% early on. Secondly, you can have even people that if they structure things right with their diet, that say they eat a high amount of protein, and they're still doing resistance training, and they're just willing to be a lot more hungry, they can do a very aggressive diet for a few weeks and essentially diet for a shorter period of time and aim for more weight loss. So say if they took, in the case of my example, right, if I were to do it, instead of dieting for 8 to 10 weeks at a sustainable rate, what I could do is go on a very aggressive diet for 4 weeks and target the same amount of body weight drop, but just try and keep my protein super high, keep doing resistance training, and have a much more aggressive calorie deficit. And I can probably get most of that dieting done in that short window of time. Then there's obviously downsides to that, in that it may impact training performance if that's a priority for you. And then that's kind of the main issue there. And it's obviously a lot more difficult to do because you're eating under eating by so much that it becomes you're very hungry and tired, etc. But it's possible to do that. So a number of people can do that. It just depends on the person and their preference for how aggressive they want to diet.
Yeah, I think as well, the more advanced you get, the more you can play around with more aggressive blocks. Like I did one last year. I think the last time I actually met you down in Limerick, I was just coming off the back of one, and I'm planning on putting a 4-week stint in soon now as well, before we get underway with championship and the hurling as well, just to pull back a bit in the body fat I've gained over the last 6 months. But again, it's all individual. It's all based on where their ultimate long-term goal is as well. And I think, Danny, the phases you mentioned was brilliant, because we get so many people, like we might set 12-week goal, we might even set a 16-week, 24-week goal, but within that 24-week, once you go beyond 12 weeks, we factor in breaks, social events, etc., etc. So somebody might be away for a week holiday, 2-week holiday, but it's still, we still have to literally make them realise the bigger picture. Like if they're up a pound or two from that, it's a good thing, because they've had a mental break from it all and they're ready to go back into another period now again. And it's nice to highlight that as well and hear from you, because I think some people beat themselves up if they do take a break from dieting as such, because they're so focused on chasing down this result or pant size they want to get into, or level of body fat, whatever it is, that they completely miss the bigger picture of enjoying the process along the way, and just enjoying food in those periods where your intake is back up a bit more as well. Now we've got an absolute mountain of stuff gone through there already, Danny, and I know we're tight for time, so I'm not gonna dive too much into the next topic quickly, but I think we both fell for this in the past. Like I think you mentioned this last year at your seminar when I was there, and I didn't really know it, so I was like, whoa, I can relate to him a bit more. But I started off in getting after my nutrition a bit better, and I came across the whole paleo route, and I went down that zone of I can only eat this, I can't eat dairy, I can't eat gluten, I can't eat X, Y, or Z. Certain foods are better for fat loss, like superfoods and whatnot. But I think the easiest way we can round all that up, Danny, is like there's no need to do it unless there's, I don't know, is this the right way to put it, nothing medically wrong with you, if that's a very, very dumbed down way to say it. But what would your views be on that?
Yeah, so like you said, David, I think the biggest thing that I've been talking about quite a lot on the podcast and in seminars over the past year has kind of been this idea of trying to look at the principles of, say, eating for body composition and eating for health versus specific methods. Because we can take literally any diet that has ever been talked about or ever came out, and there's been people who have made progress on that and lost weight on every single type of diet. So whether that's paleo, whether it's gluten-free, whether it's low-fat, whether it's vegan, whether it's Weight Watchers, wherever it's a detox diet, whatever these things are, we know that there are people who have lost weight on them. Now, the success rates come down to, well, how many people sustain that weight loss over time, and that's a whole separate issue. But the point is they all can achieve weight loss if that's the goal. And we also know people who've probably improved their health on all those diets as well. So, but they are all just different methods to achieve it, and they are all working by the exact same principles. So if we understand what principles they're working by, then we can set up the diet in whatever way we want. And so, like you mentioned, for me, I had a similar experience to yourself in that the trap we can fall into is believing that one diet is the best way to go, or one diet is great because it worked, instead of understanding and asking, why did it work? So let's take, for me, years back, I embarked on a paleo diet with kind of lower in carbohydrate and found it very useful for me. I found that my body composition kind of improved, felt good on it, kind of enjoyed doing it for a while. And so the easy trap to fall into then is, oh, well, this diet is great. This diet is the way to go to achieve these different things. But really, it wasn't a very scientific way of thinking about it. And so when I started to try and break down then over time, as I started to look into nutritional science, was, okay, well, why did this work for me in this scenario? And what you then tend to find is, if you lose body fat on a diet, it's because that diet has done something to cause you to be in negative energy balance or to be in a calorie deficit. So most often, if someone goes on, say, a low carb diet, they end up taking out carbohydrates from their diet. So number one, eliminates a whole lot of foods that most people tend to overeat on, because the foods that, if we all think of the ones that we're most likely to overeat, will contain more carbohydrate than is allowed on a low carb diet. And then we end up replacing that with foods that are higher in protein. And then we know that has an effect on satiety and how full we feel. So it's not necessarily the low carbs or the lack of carbohydrate that's causing the fat loss. It's the fact that by trying to eat that way, you're going to end up eating less calories overall. You're going to be going into calorie deficit, and that's what's causing the fat loss. The same for every diet, right? Someone goes and becomes vegetarian or starts eating a vegan diet. It's likely because they're now eating tons of vegetables, which have a lot of fiber, a very low calorie density. Then it's going to be an issue that they are going to decrease how many calories they're consuming. So, and we could go like example after example, but that's essentially what I came to the realization, is that these diets work for certain principles. So let's look at these principles and look at what is actually necessary. And to eat by a certain method, so whether that's gluten-free, whether that's paleo, whether that's vegan, whether that's tracking calorie, whatever it is, none of these methods are necessary. It's just as long as you're doing something that achieves the principle of eating at a calorie level that suits your goal, overall eating decent quality food and getting enough, say, micronutrients, overall eating, say, enough of the certain macronutrients that are going to be conducive to whatever your goal is. So in other words, enough protein to recover from training sessions and to maximize your muscle mass if that's your goal. So doing these kind of things is the important thing, not the specific method you choose. And so that's what I found. So that's the biggest thing for people. Don't buy into one specific method, particularly if you find it very difficult to stick to. Because the main thing is just that you're doing something that you know you can do in the long term and you can adhere to. So don't make it unnecessarily hard by looking at specific methods or different fad diets that will come out from time to time, or juice detox diets or whatever. Just look at the main principles that we talked about and set them up in whatever way you wish, and we can do that.
And I think that's why as well I wanted to start off this podcast without going into that first, because I just want to get across the principles to people, make them learn it so they can. It's something that they're going to have for life. It's something that they're going to always be able to go back on and teach their actual kids as well. And I think people forget that sometimes too, because I could give Danny a plan. And I said, Danny, here, follow that for 10 weeks, come back to me. Great, you're in the shape of your life, but what the hell have you learned from that? Like, absolutely, probably nothing. Maybe you learn to read a plan and follow it. But and I know we've already mentioned example upon example, but as well, just to make people more aware. Geez, you go onto Instagram and you see these people with millions of followers, hundreds of thousands of followers that are paleo food people, and even though they might be putting out delicious looking meals, I even seen one yesterday from a relatively small lady who put up a meal that was just, I'd say, 50 or 60 grams of peanut butter in the meal alone, on top of 5 other different things and nuts and everything. And then people are thinking that this is good and healthy, and they'll go off and eat that, and they'll wonder why they're not making progress, because they're not looking at the principles. Danny, absolutely brilliant. I think we've got everything I wanted to get through there. And just to round things up before you head off, I want to ask you one little thing, and that is the biggest lesson that you have learned from 2016.
That's a good one. From 2016, I think a big one for me was just to think about limits that we can kind of place on ourselves. Perhaps mental limits is the word, but I don't want it to sound like a kind of from a kind of hippie self-help guru type thing, but more from a perspective of just so often for certain goals we have, the limiting factor sometimes is what we think is achievable. And this kind of relates back to kind of some of the discussion that we've had off air about, say, powerlifting, which is kind of the biggest thing that I've been relating this from, in that so often that where we're likely to get to or how difficult something feels depends on the perspective we view it as. So in the case we were discussing earlier of certain numbers, hitting certain numbers in certain different lifts, if you view them from the perspective of these are just these astronomical numbers that shouldn't be capable or is going to take this Trojan effort, then they can become more and more difficult, or we can do things to cause ourselves not to be able to achieve them in a certain period of time. Whereas if they just become not as big a deal because we think that they are completely within the realms of like something normal to achieve, then it can become easier. And there's a kind of resource that I've mentioned to people before is I think Greg Knuckles did a video. It's on his YouTube channel on this before, essentially talking about mental limitations to performance in lifting, but it extends to probably most other places as well, in that once you get a different frame of reference, you then can start changing your goals. So if you're around people all the time that are achieving and doing things that you want to do, it doesn't become as big a deal as if you are this outlier that is doing something that no one else has ever done, or that no one that you know has achieved before. So kind of starting to surround yourself with people who have done stuff that you're aiming to do just makes it a bit more normal and kind of removes some of that. So I think that's one thing that I've paid attention to, and trying to frame certain goals as not too out of the ordinary anymore, and as something that's very, very achievable.
All perspective, really, isn't it? And I suppose surrounding yourself with people that are maybe ahead of where you want to go is another way to put it. I know that's the way I'd look at it too. Like, brilliant, Danny. And lastly, where can people find out the most about Danny?
Yes, the best thing to do is just to go over to the website. So it's just sigmanutrition.com. There in the menu bar, you'll find all you need to find. You'll find my email address if you need to send me a question. There is all the podcasts that we've done, all our articles, and there's some details around our online coaching service for both nutrition and training that you'll find links to there. And pretty much that's it. If people are into social media, then I'm pretty much on most of the platforms that they'll be looking. So if they're on Instagram, just go Danny Lennon _Sigma Nutrition. Facebook, just type in Sigma Nutrition and you should find us. And I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I'll pop those up on the show notes page anyway, Danny, for you. And I suppose lastly, my own question is too, have you any events coming up this year?
There will be. There is no exact details out yet, but there is likely in probably April or May time, going to be a couple of smaller one-day events that we'll be running, and then the main or the annual Sigma Nutrition Conference is probably going to be later in the year, probably around September time-ish. And again, that's a full weekend, 2 full days where we kind of go deep into a lot of the topics. And but those details will be released in time. But if anyone's interested in that, if they just go to the website and just sign up to the email list, then those get sent out and will be notified of any of that stuff soon.
Perfect. It'll all be on the website anyway. Brilliant. Danny, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, buddy.
We will hopefully get you back on in the future. Chat to you soon.
For sure. Take it easy, man.
So thanks for tuning in to episode 3 again, guys, and I know that I've taken a lot away from that, so hopefully you have taken a lot away from what Danny had to say there, because the man is a wealth of information and just gets stuff across in a very, very, very easy to understand format, which is the beauty of it all. But the show notes for this episode again are over on docfitnessonline.com/podcast. Now, for episode 4, it's a bit of a mystery at the moment because I have a few guests booked in, but we just don't know who's going to be up next, so you'll have to wait and see who that is. But until then, enjoy, thanks for tuning in, and we will chat to you soon.